Hello, everyone. Hi. It's such a pleasure for me to welcome all of you here in the studio audience and at home for this joyous occasion, the celebration of Julie Stone Peters' luminous study, Law as Performance, Theatricality, Spectatorship, and the Making of Law in Ancient, Medieval, and Early Modern Europe. My name is Denise Cruz, and I'm the chair of English and Comparative Literature. My role today is actually to step aside as soon as possible so that you might hear from our brilliant panelists. In the interest of time, I will introduce them primarily by title and affiliation. I will return as moderator of the Q&A at the end. I'm delighted to first introduce our author tonight, Julie Stone Peters, the H. Gordon Garbian Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and co-chair of Columbia's Theater and Performance PhD program. A scholar of drama, performance, film, media, and the cultural history of law, recipient of Guggenheim, NEH, Fulbright, ACLS, Humboldt, and other fellowships, author of several books, and a committed and vibrant teacher. Julie's interlocutors tonight are specialists across literary, historic, linguistic, and national traditions in fields that include law and legal cultures, intellectual history and literature in periods that range from the medieval to the early modern to the contemporary. Jesus Velasco is professor and chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale. His areas of expertise include medieval and early modern legal cultures across the Mediterranean basin and Europe. Camille Probstis is a professor of French and history at Columbia. Her specialties include modern European intellectual history with a focus on 19th and 20th century France. Eleanor Johnson is associate professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and specializes in late medieval English prose, poetry and drama, medieval literary philosophy, law and literature in the Middle Ages, and vernacular theology. Collectively, the panel represents the breadth, depth, and ingenuity of Julie's work, a study that, as you will see, traces a history of entwining of law and performance, one that moves imaginatively through spaces that range from the medieval courtroom to the stocks and the scaffold to the theater via methods that draw upon history, performance studies, literary print, and legal studies in ways that illuminate, as she notes in the book, the value of encounter, the strangeness of history, the ethics and eventual possibilities of understanding contemporary legal cultures in new ways, in part to remind ourselves that, quote, things were not always as they are, nor need they always be. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and friend, Julie.
Thank you, Denise. And Denise, of course, said everything that I would have wanted to say, so I'm done. Thank you very much. No, that was beautiful, Denise. I learned recently that I was going to have to speak before all these brilliant people, and because I thought I was just going to be able to respond to their remarks. And in truth, these are not only some of the most brilliant people I know, but some of my favorite people in the world. So, so I'm only going to say very few things. I was asked to introduce the book and to say a few words about its central ideas, and also say a little word about how I got there. So, as Denise said, it is a history of legal performance through the early modern period, and that really means two things. One is the practices, the events, the things, as Denise said, that took place in courtrooms and execution sites and marketplaces and streets, and the ways people made performance through those events. So it's not, in a sense, about theater proper, but about law as a form of theater. And that goes to the second point, which is it's also a kind of history of the idea, how central the idea of performance it has been to law from the beginnings, more or less, of recorded history. So that is, it's about law's embattled relationship to its own theatricality. It's about all the many, Cicero, Quintilian saying law is not theater. It's not theater, but here's what you have to do in the courtroom to persuade your audience. Use the techniques from the actors. Study with the actors. So in a sense, it's also about, in that sense, it's also about defining law against theater. That is, answering the age-old question that legal philosophers have, continue to ask: what is law and what isn't law? But what is law? And the answer is, not theater, except of course everyone knows it really is, and we in the 21st century probably most of all. So I, as I say in the introduction, I actually didn't mean to write this book. If somebody had said to me, how about you write a book about roughly 2,000 years of legal history? I would have said, are you crazy? And in fact, what I had was a series of case studies that were very, very close readings that tried to explore a little bit of methodologies of how to read legal events as performance practices, how to interpret them in ways parallel to, they're different from the ways that we interpret texts. And I was basically done with the book. I went to some relative's house in Mexico overlooking the ocean, and I thought, I'm done, but just write a little chapter of the prehistory to say this goes back to Plato, more or less, at least, probably before. So I wrote my paragraph on Plato, and then the paragraph on Plato doubled and tripled, and then it became a chapter, and then it became 2 chapters. And I kept discovering all this incredible ancient and medieval material. And what also became very clear to me was that this was not just a kind of sideline in the history of law, that this was a central discourse that, as I've said, both created law and defined law. So that chapter became the book. And it's really the prehistory of the book that I was going to write, but I'm done enough. That'll just have to be a bunch of articles. And as that was happening, I was looking at the ocean thinking, this is so alarming. How is this chapter so big? And it's clearly 2 different chapters. But it was also really exciting, partly because I was discovering the centrality of this, both this concept and this practice, but also because I kept coming across these wild, crazy, and wonderful stories. And that's partly what I try to do in the book too, which is just convey, how law resides, it resides in doctrines and all the rest, but it resides in these moments and in these stories, and some of them are very, very tragic. But also law can be utterly histrionically bizarre and hilariously funny, and to recognize both the force and the farce of law is one thing I ended up finding I was able to do. So, and as Denise said, I really see this as helping us to understand our legal world.
Hello. And thank you for inviting me to here. I am very glad to be again in Heiligen Mauern. I won't continue that line of quotations, don't worry. I am honored to be here, to have had the opportunity to read this book that immediately inspired in me this moment of Horace's Epistula ad Pisones, Charles, in which he says, and of course I'm going to quote it in Latin because I'm that pedantic, omni tulit punctum quibisque tutile dulci lectorem delectando pariter premonendo, and I think it's with the right extension. And it was maybe the one that hits the target is the one that is able to write, teaching something while at the same time keeping us entertained. This is a very entertaining book, but that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say it's written here and I'm going to read it because it's exactly 8 minutes. And that's the time I was alive. So when I first read Julie Stone Peters' Law as Performance, I thought I had entered the world of a makama. A makama is an old narrative genre that seems to never have enough. It is unquenchable. It experiments with the central story that has 1001 connected stories. It experiments with philosophical and theoretical speculations. It experiments with poetry. It experiments with language, because language is, as Alba Noe put it once, a strange tool that needs to be played with in an unstoppable way. It would be fair to say that Julie's book is of that kind. She indeed experiments with all those elements. And in addition, she also plays with languages because she is thirsty for working with the constellation of worlds that each language represents in their own particular way of determining how to talk about law and how to talk about those who act. There is, she says, one central story, or even one central history, the history of something that has been happening more or less in the shadow of scholarly interests for a disordinate amount of centuries. And that interconnects frequently in a polemic way, the world of the law with the world of theatricality, of performance, of spectatorship. I will call this interconnection an affinity. And the notion of affinity renders visible the complicated relationship that law and theater have entertained throughout the years. They parasite each other, while at the same time reject each other as constitutive part of themselves. This affinity, the movement of selection, exploitation, mining, extraction, and rejection mean one important thing. For this affinity to do its work in history, those two modalities of existing in society and in political life need to recognize each other as effective and legitimate interlocutors. Well, but how did that go? It is not about telling a story or a history or a genealogy, but to explain how each of the actors participating in this history engaged with it. How did they tell it? What did they want to get from it? And what kind of ideas did these actors end up deploying in order to say, sure, here is the affinity, now let's make it really complicated, because simplicity is not what makes intellectual and social life, and we really want to mess with those. Here is where the 1001 interconnected stories come up and unveil the very interiority of the presumed master narrative, the affinity itself. For that purpose, Julie did get in conversation with everybody in any language, from Plato and Aristotle to, let's say, because one has to say something, Jeremy Bentham. So yeah, the questioner, the interviewing, the questioner, the interviews go more or less this way. So what do you think about law's performance? What are the disciplines from which you talk about this? What are the words, ideas, considerations you want me to keep from what you think? This line of questioning defines both the methodology and the very close reading of textual and visual sources Julie interrogates. And this is well and fine, but it's not all. Why would somebody need to know anything about all this beyond its historical and scholarly interest? Because we agree, Julie is a wonderful scholar and one who has transformed her fields of study in many occasions, like when she published about the theater of the book, or about women's rights and human rights, or when she wrote that article on the field of law and literature that completely changed how we looked at it from the PMLA watchtower of the humanities. It is really a book on, bear with me, theatricality, spectatorship, and the making of law in ancient, medieval, and early modern Europe. It's a little more than that. And you would say, but what, do you think this is not enough? And sure, I know it is more than enough, more than I would ever be capable not of doing, just of envisioning. It is a heroic plan. And yet this book is much more than that, or at least it is much more than that to me. Firstly, by examining those interconnected stories and narrating the history of this affinity between the law and theater, Julie is also talking about legal subjectivity. The history of the construction of the legal subject comes up through this affinity, among other reasons, because both law and theater are uniquely interested in actors and how they represent characters that receive the Greek name of ethos, same lexical root as ethics, and the Latin translation of mores, same as morals, or they also represent rotuli, specific codifications contained within a rolled paper, and of course, this is the lexical origin of role. The question of the presentation of the self in society, which owes so much to the analysis of theater, takes here a completely different turn because it transforms what Julie calls the making of law. This making, I think she clearly demonstrates as well, is not the result of codification, statutes, legal scholarship, and other aspects of the poetics of the law as practiced by the professionals of the discipline, because the legal subject is not a professional of the legal discipline, even if the legal subject as a private person is an attorney or a judge or notary. The making of a law is a collaborative, messy, complicated issue, one of whose aspects is the hermeneutical and the heuristic conceptual map that arises from the study of its theatricality. What the interconnected stories in this history show is the emergence of such conceptual map. Studying the authors that debate the affinity between law and theater, we are in the disposition of gathering the concepts or notions they have deployed throughout history. Those concepts and notions constitute a historical approach to the political problems that inhere in this affinity, including the artificial separation between politics and law that we see roaming the media or the Supreme Court in our days. Those notions and concepts, not extracted, but rather cultivated and harvested in Julie's book, are necessary to unveil the dynamics of the construction and the interpretation of the legal subject. What are the nodes in this conceptual cartography? The answer to this question requires you to read the book, and you will enjoy its 1001 stories that will keep you alive for as many nights. But I will give you a hint. Rather than being exclusively verbal concepts that belong in a philosophical, highly theoretical, or intellectual history, these concepts are the connecting tissue between the cold representation of the legal subject and the physical, natural person with emotions, memories, sensorial and post-sensorial passions. These concepts constitute the emotional landscape, the atmosphere that makes the law possible in the world. Perhaps they are the ones that will always cry out loud that yes, even if the law is not a show, it is still a theatrical set of what Lubomir Dolezhel called heterocosmica, different worlds therein represented and configured to clash in the most astonishing set of tragedies. Some of those concepts are of spatial nature, as the affinity between the law and theater is an ongoing production of space. The law, like theater, always looks for new spaces where it can take place. Queen of York's church is one of those spaces, but we can think of others, like the marketplace, the open spaces where people watch the judicial resolutions. Think of the auto da fe, or the execution of Damien, as told by Michel Foucault. Julie's book delves into the question of the open court, the ways in which the law, by means of its scholars and practitioners, touches a space, the Rechtsstaat, for instance, mobile objects, even images on books, to set the legal process in place. The law, one of the fundamental concepts of this book, is always producing new spaces, and in a way, colonizing all spaces of public life and interaction to juridify them by means of movements, language, and emotions that are proper to the theater. This is also the making of law. Some of the concepts of this cartography are more clearly related to the production and control of emotions. Julie's discussion of the venerable idea of catharsis takes us from Aristotle and his theorization of this purgative moment to the way in which it has been commented, only to conclude that catharsis is a fundamental emotion taking place in contemporary trials, for instance, those related to international courts dealing with mass atrocities, for which the moment of catharsis is the expectation of the emotion that derives from a just resolution. Emotions are not just of an individual nature. they are also collective. And above all, they create community. So spatial, emotional concepts that point to movements, to language. This is the amazing cartography of concepts that derive from the debates on the affinity between theater and law that arise when you, Julie, with immense erudition, care, detail, elegance, and yes, too, joy, study law as performance. Thank you.
Hello, it's really nice to see human beings. Forgot how cool this was. Thank you all for making this happen, being here, Julie. I love your book. However, this talk is 1 minute long, so I'm not going to dwell on all the things I love about it. I'm just going to go. So as someone who's spent decades studying medieval English property law and simultaneously living in the decisively post-medieval legal state that is America, I found Julie's book absolutely fascinating. Of the myriad responses I could imagine giving to her work, I'm going to limit myself to 2, which hurts me deeply. First, I'm going to lean into my scholarly expertise, which again is medieval English law of property, to give a kind of different type of example of how that law availed itself of fiction and performance. And second, I'm going to lean into my own lived experience, which is being a citizen of the United States in the contemporary spectacle that is American law. So law has always, including in the Middle Ages, labored under the banner of realism. The law is supposed to arrive at truth. It's supposed to wrestle with evidence and arrive at an accurate representation of something that happened at some point in the past. But ironically, as Julie shows time and time again, to get to the true representation of what happened, the law has always relied on fictions. It's always relied on devices. It's always relied on artificial mechanisms, and it's always relied on actors and even directors. Julie's book focuses primarily on the performances of lawyers and litigants themselves and on how their personal theatricalities contributed to and in many ways determined the outcomes of trials. So to elaborate a little bit from there on different ways in which performance could signify in the past practice of the law, I want to talk a little bit about a performance at law by someone who wasn't so much an actor in the sense that Julie is often focused on in her book, but more like a prop in a larger legal narrative. So bear with me. You can either go to sleep with your eyes open for 10 minutes or learn about medieval property law, which I guarantee you is less boring than it seems. So the year is 1285. A lot was going wrong. Not quite as much as in the year 2020, but close. But one thing happened that was really interesting and significant and kind of semi-positive, at least for a while, which was the promulgation of this statute called De Donis Conditionalibus on conditional gifts. This was enacted in England, and it created a channel for bequeathing property other than primogeniture. This is actually a really big deal because the only way to bequeath real estate prior to this moment was to give it to your eldest son. Once De Donis Conditionalibus is enacted, it allows a landholder to bequeath his land to any of his sons or even look out to his daughters, right? So this is a big deal, or in fact to anybody else. It even allowed a landholder to do this without stipulating a reason, without justifying, just to say, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to do it. This kind of bequeathing of land was called an entail. And those of you who studied Jane Austen should be going, this does not end well. And of course, you're right. The problem with the entail is that it created very, very hyper-structured and rigid modes of property disposal that went on for generations and generations and generations. So for example, starting in 1285, let's imagine that I'm a man who could actually own property. I could have said to myself in my will and everyone else after me, I bequeath my property to my daughter, Joan, and all the female heirs begotten on her body. So that's 2 successive generations in which none of my male heirs can inherit anything of mine. That's a problem, right? Or if we sort of like play out the narrative of Pride and Prejudice a little bit, somebody said in the Bennet family, I'm going to bequeath my property to Mr. Bennet and all the male heirs of his body begotten. Defaulting a male heir, it will revert to eventually Mr. Collins. So these structures of property disposition were great in that if, for example, your eldest son was like a horrible drinking, gambling Lothario, but your second child, female, was like very learned, responsible, and good at managing money, you were not posed for like many successive generations. It was bad in that it created this mechanism where one person's desire to control their land could determine what happened for 100 years, right? So medieval practitioners of the common law developed this fascinating legal dodge, this fiction, which is called the collusive recovery. And it literally goes like this. Somebody owns land and they want to sell it, but they can't because of the entail. So they go to court and they say to some random other person, hey, I can't sell you this land because somebody gave it to me who's not letting me give it to you. That person, the third person in this scenario, is called a common vouchee. They are literally a paid member of the court. Here's what they do. They get named and they have to show up and say, yes, I gave this land to the first party who wants to sell the land. And therefore it's okay. And I'm in control of this land. You can't do anything about it. Their whole job is to screw up. So this is a paid court appointee whose job was to literally show up in court and then run out. That's what they would run in and be like, and run out. And that enabled the judge to claim default on the case. And then the entail was broken and the first party could sell the land to anyone they wanted. This is like an aggressive fiction, right? No one is confused. Everyone in the room knows exactly what happened here. The judge knows it's a fiction. Everybody knows it's a fiction. And that wasn't a problem, which is actually the interesting part, right? The English common law has always been a hot mess of truth and fiction mixed together, proof and conjecture, oaths and lies. And Julie's book emphasizes this with a host of examples and finds it on the continent too, which, I mean, it wasn't sort of intuitive news to me, but to see it in detail, I was really shocked and thrilled by. So trying to grapple with this hot mess, this weird admixture of truth and fiction in the Middle Ages, about 20 years ago, this medievalist named Richard Firth Green wrote a great book called The Crisis of Truth. And in it, he persuasively shows that the word truth itself shifts meaning in the 14th century from meaning something like honor. We now have this in the word betrothed, your troth, right? When you are betrothed, you're giving your troth, your honor, your honestas to another person. So the word truth shifts in the 14th century from meaning that to meaning something more like a documentarily verifiable fact, right? You really can track this out. One of the interesting sort of manifestations of it is in the early 14th century in England, you'll have people saying my truth, his truth, her truth, and at the end it's the truth. So there's a shift from like a subjective troth to an objective truth, okay? So this is all going on in the 14th century. And basically Richard Firth Green argues that with that semantic shift, there's this procedural shift with the law where things like trial by ordeal die the final death, and things like documentary evidence win the day. So the narrative that Richard Firth Green lends is that basically troth dies and facts and documents win. We see this dynamic played out, I think, really wonderfully in the very beginning of Julie's book, one of the opening anecdotes where she talks about the very last English trial by ordeal. I love this story, Julie. I like died. So it goes like this. So everybody shows up ready to see these two guys duke it out in a battle, trial by battle. They want it, everyone's showing up because they want to see these two guys, their troughs, like pitted against each other. But instead, it turns out they have to call it all off because it turns out they had signed documents the day before to sort of obviate the necessity for the trial by ordeal. So like transparently, document beats troth. It's like a more efficient mechanism. It works better. Great. But what I find most exciting about Julie's work is how it shows that even after documentary truth had won the day ideologically in legal history, honestas, troth, remained a huge part of how the law was enacted in practice, as an actual practiced reality. The examples Julie draws on from legal history, both in England and on the continent, well into the 17th century, clearly demonstrate that truth is produced and ratified not only by the documents that seek to enshrine it as fact, but also by the successfulness of lawyers and litigants' embodiments of their honestas, of their troth. Richard Firth Green, I think, is absolutely right when he says that documents beat out troth or honestas as the mainstay of legal proof. But to say that troth or honestas didn't matter anymore, that would be crazy. And Julie's whole book proves that it would be crazy to say that. As Julie demonstrates time and again, though documents and facts win out in the long run in the ideology of legal truth, performance and spectacle always matter in practice. Middle Ages, early modern period, no question. And they still matter now. So take, for example, I'm now going to pivot to the 21st century and all the things that terrify me and keep me up at night. Take, for example, the recent defamation trial of Amber Heard. That trial was largely not about challenging the facts of the case. No one really questioned whether there was domestic abuse that had happened. No one really contested them. That wasn't the issue. Instead, the trial was almost entirely about performance and spectacle and about who was able to curry more sympathy from the viewing audience, which in that case was not only the people in the room, in the courtroom, but tens of millions of online viewers who followed it play by play. This is like the open courtroom par excellence, right? Indeed, in this trial, we had occasion to see what happens when the openness of the courtroom is totally boundless and superintended by infinite commentaries and influencers. Johnny Depp and his legal team realized perfectly well what Julie shows that Cicero and Quintilian understood, namely that if you can convince the audience that you're better, you can win a case. The facts are actually less compelling than your performance of your troth, of your honestas, of your legitimacy. As Julie says, although judges officially decided cases in Roman law courts, the cheers or hisses of the crowd still mattered and could, as in Athens, be decisive. The judge on the Depp Heard case definitely had some power. The jury certainly made the final verdict, but the pressure of the massive diffuse audience was clearly decisive. Not a single juror in that jury box could possibly have been uninfluenced by the circus of spectacular representation that grew up around the case. So to sum up, I'll say that as much as I admire and appreciate Julie's work on medieval and early modern jurisprudence, I think some of the greatest import of her study actually points toward now, the present and the future practice and theorizing of American law. Our popular understanding of what the law is and how it works needs to admit that facts are not, nor have they ever been, the only thing under examination in a trial. As in Athens, as in Rome, as in the Middle Ages and in early modern Europe, so in American contemporary law, spectacle reigns supreme. And unfortunately, it probably always will.
So hi, everyone. I also want to thank Julie for inviting me to this conversation around her fantastic book, even though I'm not a medievalist or an early modernist, but as you can probably tell from the previous comments, it's really a fascinating read. It's provocative, original, innovative, and really quite hilarious. As Jesus mentioned, I also loved the first trial and it had me laughing out loud. Julie also inserts herself in the discussion at all times. She'll write things like yawn when she gets to boring details. So you can kind of follow along with Julie's commentary in the background. So it's beautifully written and a pleasure to read. With remarkable ease and admirable clarity, Julie walks us through centuries and through genres from literature, philosophy, rhetorical manuals, plays, and of course, law. Since I only have 8 minutes, I'm going to focus on 2 of the points, and I'm also devastated by this because there's so many other points I want to talk about, but I'll focus on 2 that I found the most interesting and exciting about this project. The first is what I would call Julie's deconstructive approach to the law, and the second has to do with the book's chronology. So first on the question of law. As I've mentioned before, as people have mentioned before, the argument that Julie puts forth in this book is not only that performance produces and enacts law, or that aesthetics are essential to understanding the force of law, but more poignantly, she suggests that performances take on a life, or she shows also how performances take on a life of their own. They are not easy to control, and in fact, as much as her evidence shows, they are often not controlled. In order to make this claim, Julie reminds us of the 2 definitions of performance. First, as a particular form of expression in which a set of actions signify, present, demonstrate, or enact something that is real or imagined for an audience. And second, as a universal condition closer to what we would call today performativity. So I'm citing Julie here. The fact that what appears natural is in fact produced and reproduced through performance on the stage of life. These 2 understandings of performance are not exactly the same, but they do converge when overt performance seems to reveal the performativity of everyday life, and more specifically here, the performativity of law. Now, there is, of course, a large body of scholarship on performativity, and Julie refers to it throughout her book, but I wonder if I can push her a little further on thinking about the consequences of this argument for our understanding of law. For example, in the field of gender studies, the idea that gender is performative has led critics from Judith Butler and beyond to argue that gender is always appropriated, theatricalized, changed. But most importantly, perhaps, these critics have insisted on the fact that there is no original gender that these performance or reproductions refer to. Instead, gender comes into being through this process. To cite Catherine Von Stockton's new book, gender, even in its most normative expressions, is always a little queer, a little fake, a little improper. So what would it mean, I wonder, to consider law along similar lines as always a little queer? In other words, if we accept Julie's idea that law is produced through these performances and that law and theater are not so easy to separate, could we embrace on a normative level this understanding of law as inherently improper, inherently unstable? And to be sure, we're all used to thinking about the semantic instability of literary texts, including theater, but this is still much less true of law. What would this notion of law look like? And I often think about this in a sort of a different realm in relation to psychoanalysis. What would it mean, for example, for law to take on a psychoanalytic notion of the subject, one in which the unconscious and desires were central? How could we rethink the legal parameters around a question, for example, like such as consent, if we foreground the vicissitudes of desire as opposed to the coherence of a rational and autonomous centered self? So similarly, I wonder, how can this deconstructive vision of law change our understanding of the potential, the limits, and the inherent contradictions of law? So that's the first point. The second comment has to do with the chronology of the book, which, as we said before, spans from antiquity to the 17th century. So Julie's point here is not to suggest that there is a seamless continuity between all these periods, but rather she says that this longue durée approach allows her to move past what she calls period exceptionalism. I thought that was really interesting. As she puts it, this approach shows how this tradition waxes and wanes, crosses borders, disappears, and reemerges in utterly new disguises. In other words, I think we could say that Julie is making a structural argument about law rather than a historical one. And the person who immediately came to mind as I was reading this part was Michel Foucault. Julie mentions him at the end of the book, but I wonder again if we could return to Foucault for a moment, and more specifically to his own chronology in Discipline and Punish. In that book, Foucault famously grounds his argument on the premise of a great and profound transformation or shift between the early modern and the modern period, a shift in the administration of punishment. So from the gory spectacle of pain and brutality to the emergence of the modern prison where bodily harm disappears. For Foucault, or appears to disappear. For Foucault, these two periods are symptomatic of a different understanding of sovereignty and power. So we go from a kind of superpower in the early modern period where punishment was imagined as the restoration of sovereignty, because sovereignty is associated with the figure of the king, and crime is understood as an affront against his very person, to the invisible, subtle, and continuous disciplinary power that characterizes our modern time. Now, the transition that Foucault describes occurs after Julie's book ends, since the book ends at the end of the 17th century. But I'm curious to ask Julie how the shifts that she is tracing in this book, how the shifts in legal performance affect or relate this question of sovereignty. How did law and sovereignty relate to one another? And how can we think sovereignty through this kind of longue durée approach in the different periods you describe? So I will end here, but I want to again congratulate Julie on this really impressive accomplishment and thank her again for inviting me to comment on this excellent book.
Yes, the response.
All right. Well, it's always a little hard to be a respondent when you don't know what anybody's going to say. And when there are so many ideas on the table, that makes it even harder. So I will attempt to make these a little less scattered than they are in my mind, but just say, you know, it's so wonderful to see my book through these different lenses and to think, oh yes, I should have written about that, and I should have written about that, and now I'll have to write another book just like this one. Anyway, I really appreciate both the homage and the way and the ideas that emerged. So just to start, I'll just go more or less in order. I love Jesus's account of my book as a history of legal subjectivity. I never really thought about it that way because, of course, I'm always thinking about the body and, you know, the way in which the body performs, and, you know, the subject always sounds so internal, and yet it is actually very much that, because it's about the ways in which in which the subject is in fact shaped by what the body does and what we perform and where we are and the spaces we're in and who's there and who's before us. So so I love this idea somehow that we could write a history of the constitution of the legal subject, and Jesus says as a character and as an actor, and I think that's very true to my book. But I also feel like there are a lot of people doing really interesting work in law and humanities. This table, and I feel like there are many histories of legal subjectivity to be written with an understanding that subjectivity is a material enterprise. That we live our subjectivity in the material world. So that is a whole field that I hope you will preside over in your next, in your many lives. And I also really appreciate Jesus's account of the fact that the legal subject is not necessarily professional, and even more, that even the professional legal subject isn't necessarily professional. Even the lawyer, had a bad day, is scared, doesn't, is tired, doesn't want to come before the Duke again. That everybody's sort of fighting to do the thing they're supposed to do the thing they're trying to do, but always feeling that somehow it doesn't quite fit, nothing makes sense. They have to work to make themselves into the person they need to be in the courtroom, whether it's the lawyer or the litigant or even the judges who, sometimes get drunk in my book or fall asleep. We've all had this experience where, right now probably, we're performing our professional selves and ourselves as advocates while having other voices going on in our heads and doing things with our bodies. And that's partly what my third chapter is about all these really incredible medieval accounts of how people's bodies act up on them when they're in the courtroom. So, you get sexual desires, or then there's one who says, you could be so scared in front of the judge that, I'm forgetting his word, but it's something like, you let loose a small tribute from your bowels. It's so heartbreaking. Okay. And also the ongoing production of space, the law's ongoing production of space, and I think it's really important what Jesus says about its colonization of space. There are a lot of people doing absolutely incredible work now in law and humanities on legal space, and by that they mean, the construction of big geographical spaces, and also the construction of local spaces, and how those two things are completely connected. So we need to write those histories, and as Jesus says, it's producing new spaces, it's colonizing new spaces, it's juridizing. I just read an incredible short story, this is a total parenthesis, called The Court of Monuments, in which it's a story, a very sort of Kafkaesque story in which, the court decides to manage the monuments in the city, and slowly but surely the court grows and grows and grows and takes over the city. And I feel as if it's a parable of what we live, because law is, I don't usually like to say increasingly as a historical thing, but in fact, law is increasingly colonizing our lives. And then just one word about catharsis, about what Jesus said about catharsis. His account is right, but I also want to say that part of what I say is that the use of the word for instance, war crimes, tribunals, etc., is often to me very sentimental, and it actually misreads Aristotle, who writes about catharsis in a bunch of different texts, in the politics, not just the poetics. And Aristotle's view of catharsis, if you put it in conversation with Plato and some other people, is in fact that catharsis is not about just getting rid of the bad emotions and everybody feeling better and can't we all just be friends, and then we are all friends. But actually it's about channeling anger for change. And that is, I think, important to Aristotle, and I hope important to what some legal things can do. Okay. Eleanor, oh my goodness, okay. I love going into the medieval law of property I know nothing about whatsoever. And the only thing that I know is that there were traditions of marching juries around sites to mark at the performing of the boundaries of the site. Come in, right? Okay. But I love this incredible story of how the collusive recovery, the paid member of the court, whose job is to run in and then perform the default. And it is a little bit like the story that Camille referred to, that I start with in the introduction, because Eleanor talked, wait, now I'm forgetting who, you both did, yeah, you both did. It's a fun story. If you read nothing else, it's 3 pages, read that. But the story is that there are 4,000 people there in Tothill Fields, which is this big entertainment ground, and they actually moved the whole Court of Common Pleas, the actual judges of the Court of Common Pleas, to judge this trial by battle, and they build a little replica of the Court of Common Pleas there in Tothill Fields, with, they say, all the furniture exactly replicated, and the judge is there, and one of the combatants, because of course you don't fight your own trial by battle, you purchase combatants, and one of the combatants is this incredibly theatrical guy, and he's doing costume changes and marching around the field. And when he gets to when he gets up to the judge, and the other combatant, who's this kind of ugly big thug, also gets there. And the judge, this is the Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, says, sorry, we're calling this off. He doesn't tell that there was a document. He just says, we're calling this off. And the theatrical guy says, wait a minute, can't we just exchange a few blows for the entertainment of the court and the audience? And nobody ever says that the reason it's being called off is because behind the scenes there was already a decision, and the whole thing was there just to confirm, that to show, that the plaintiff had defaulted. Anyway, the basic point is the lesson is, of course, in a sense, law is this big spectacle, but the whole cancellation of the thing was sort of a chastising of the audience for wanting to come and see law as a big spectacle, because after all, that's not what law is supposed to be. All right, okay. Thank you for bringing up Green's Crisis of Truth, which I looked at too quickly because I didn't fully. Now I have a full understanding in the way that I didn't before, and also a recognition of the moment, and this is, I think, really illuminating, the moment in which that even becomes an ideology. And I suppose that there are other places, earlier where truth is always, in a sense, an ideology, but the nature, and it's an ideology that stands against theater. We're not going to have all these actors, lawyers performing in the courtroom. We're going to have truth. But then, of course, and that itself is a performance. The performance of the truthiness of law is itself a performance, and sometimes that takes the form also of the occult. What you're not seeing, what's behind the scenes, must be really the power and the authority of true law, the people who really know. And we certainly have this today. So as Eleanor says, truth still matters, even when the document wins. Truth is still produced and ratified by embodiment. And thank you for bringing us up to the horrendous Johnny Depp trial, which is really, of course, every 10 minutes there's a trial of the century. Every 10 minutes, and we'll forget about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard very soon, because there will be some other trial of the century that will take its place. But we do live in this world of unbelievable immediate legal spectacle in our hands, and we have to think harder, I think about what that means, and that is partly what I want to write about next, as well as some of the ways that reading performance and understanding spectacle matter. So, what do police officers see when they think they see a body doing something? What do they see when they shoot? What are they seeing bodies doing, and how are they interpreting it? Or, what does it mean when police officers say, you cannot film what we're doing here, this arrest, because you are interfering with the practice of the law? Or what does it mean when we don't video confessions, or when we do? There's a lot of questions that have to do with legal spectacle. All right, I'm gonna move on. I totally have no idea of time, so 2 minutes, perfect. Okay, so I love, Camille, thank you for saying it's a deconstructive approach, because I don't think of myself as doing that. And of course, yet when I don't do sort of classical deconstruction, and yet it is true, not only that it is a deconstruction of law generally, but that, even though I write about performance, language and words, the texts that are my evidence for performance really matter to me. And I see the ways in which the words undo themselves. Thank you for bringing up this model of gender that we all think of. I love the idea that gender is always a little queer. That's so right. But I love as much the idea that law is always a little queer. Law is always a little unstable. Law is never doing what you think it's supposed to be doing. And in something, same thing that I said about Jesus's remarks, that I don't think of what I'm doing as a history of legal subjectivity. I don't think of what I'm doing as a sort of psychoanalytic history of law. And yet, my way of understanding events is to unpack them in the way that we unpack the psyche. Sometimes I do it with performance, sometimes I do it with what people say they're feeling and experiencing when they're in a courtroom or at an execution site. So I think that's really, really right. And I want to write that one too. The third version. Foucault. Okay, so and periodization and Foucault. Well, I'm always annoyed by the Foucauldian radical break when Virginia Woolf, now I think it's Sarah, all of a sudden, on or about the year.
December 19th.
Everything changed. So elsewhere, I have actually written quite a bit about Foucault, and quite a bit about how weirdly different his account of the panopticon is from Bentham's account, where in Bentham it's just full of people everywhere, and everybody's playing and making noise, and there's no like quiet guards in a tower just like rigidly watching people behind bars. So about that, and also about ongoing performance cultures in the 19th century where we don't expect them. So huge culture of prison tourism in England and the US, where prisons were entertainment venues, sort of like insane asylums. They were, they were places where people went to pity the poor prisoners, etc. So that's just one place where the culture of spectatorship goes on when people say it's supposed to be have already been finished. Public floggings, etc., etc. All these things in the 19th century that Foucault, the defense is, he's not playing that kind of historian. He's playing somebody else doing interventions of thought, and then he revises thought later. Then he starts saying, well, okay, beginning of the 19th century, but actually let's go back to, ancient times. So this is not a critique of Foucault as much as a way of recognizing how important that culture of spectacle continues to be. And just to, in one sentence, try to answer your question, how do these shifts relate to the question of sovereignty? Okay, I would say it's not a question of a movement from one kind of, we have stories about, the royalty, et cetera, as sovereign, a shift to the people as sovereign, and that is true and a really important part of political history, but I think law also messes with that. And I can say more, but I think my time is out, except to say thank you for 3 truly